This is Left Hand, and I am your host, Sarepty, also known as Craig, of the Acid Horizon podcast. Let's begin with a question. What happens when the very ground of knowledge shifts beneath our feet? What if the forms we call structure are only fleeting pauses in a deeper, ongoing surge of becoming? If you've been with us before, maybe you remember Timothy Jackson from our earlier episode on Simondon, where we explored individuation, metastability, and the strange, dynamic life of form. Today, we're continuing that exploration, but from a different angle, one that moves through Darwin, Simondon again, and George Bataille, into the heart of some of Timothy's new work on excess, ontogenesis, and the critique of closure in physicalist science. This is a conversation about variation as first principle, about the limits of rationalism, and about the realities that overflow our systems of explanation, and about what happens when we take ontogenesis itself as the starting point for philosophy. Timothy, I want to welcome you back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Craig.
So, let's begin on this familiar terrain. The limits of rationalism have been an ongoing theme on Left Hand, not to mention across much of the work that we do on Acid Horizon. The insistence on rational politics, a rational ethics, a rational account of knowledge has long been a kind of bugbear for those of us in these shared circles. And the question that keeps returning is, how do we think the so-called irrational or the excessive without immediately subordinating it to the demands of the rational? And it's an issue that recurs everywhere on this podcast, whether we're talking about psychological life, metaphysical speculation, or the sciences of mind or nature. And this touches a perennial problem. What do we do with metaphysics? And this is a place where I want to start today, as a discipline, as a historical inheritance of sorts. And for some of us, almost an addiction, I would say. How do we resist the temptation to build neat, bounded systems in which variation gets explained away as mere degrees, deviations, and errors? So let's start there. We're going to talk about your emphasis on excess variation and the irreducibility of ontogenesis or ontogenesis. I'm probably going to say both pronunciations today, so please excuse me in advance. And these are themes that push directly against those rationalist boundaries. And before we get to those details, I warned you, Timothy, I was going to ask you the huge question coming at you. What do you see as the place of metaphysics today? Not only given the issues that we're going to cover later, but just the wider landscape, scientific advance, global crisis, and the various forms of collapse that might be defining the 21st century.
Yeah, wow, that is firstly, a great introduction and touching on so many of the themes, so incisively, which always makes it kind of difficult to follow in a sense, right? Metaphysics. What is the place of metaphysics and how do we avoid a certain kind of temptation? I think maybe we're going to talk about how we avoid that temptation. That might be a bit of a recurrent theme. So I won't come to that straight away. What is the place of metaphysics? It depends on what we mean by metaphysics, obviously. So there is a kind of classical notion of metaphysics, which is precisely that sort of creation of a closed system of categories, which essentially exhausts being. So every part of being can neatly be fit into one of those categories. And then, there's what I think is a more modern conception, maybe, although again, it is hard to avoid this sort of immediate assimilation of the term metaphysics to that classical, ontotheological notion of metaphysics. And so, maybe people sometimes prefer to say, well, we're not doing metaphysics, but we are going to do ontology, and we'll get to this Simondonian point of ontogenesis, that's how I say it, of as first philosophy. So in some sense, ontogenesis has to come before ontology. And then there would be no ontology, there's no singular ontology necessarily, right? Ontogenesis being this ongoing process, which perhaps leads to the genesis, the construction of ontologies. And so we might, get to that as well. But the way I like to think about metaphysics, because I still do want to use the term, it's too important a term to abandon, perhaps too important a practice to abandon. I want to think about it in terms of things like the most generic description we can have of the nature of things or something like that. That's already very problematic, especially as I used, loaded terms like nature and things and that sort of thing. But it's something about generalization, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean this exhaustive systemic approach. What it can mean, generalization can, in a sense, be synonymized with minimalization. So whatever is most generic is in some sense going to have to be pretty vague in order to maintain that generic status. And because we're thinking here in a kind of, we have an orientation towards becoming or process, I like to think of it as, metaphysics is, I have a diagrammatic approach, which we can get into. There's a bit of Charles Sanders that comes in here, but it is an attempt to describe the minimal conditions of realization. So what is the minimum kind of set of conditions that are, in some sense, I suppose you could say, necessary for things to be realized, or for happenings, I guess, but for ontologizing, for the genesis of things or more or less formed processes. We're going to have to problematize this notion of a thing as well, right? Especially if we get into Bataille and his relationship with things and thingification and objectification and all of these things. So why do we need to do this, though? Why should we try to think this most general, or why should we try to think in the metaphysical register? I think it's in a fairly, well-worn sense. It's because if we repress it, we're going to be subject to a return of that repressed, right? If we don't explicitly engage with the presuppositions of our own thinking, they're going to animate our thought in an unconscious manner. And I think, part of my project, of course, is a kind of philosophy of science, and I am a scientist, and that is the background that I'm coming out of. And I think it's just really obvious when you look at the history of modern science and say the perspective of classical physics and its actual descent from classical theology, and the way in which, as the theological words at least, were stripped out of that conception, the theological operators, or the function of like God, for example, actually remains embedded in that worldview. I mean, even in the formalisms that define, so this is the notion of effective theorization that we might get into, but the formalisms that define the practice of physicalist science, God is kind of like embedded in there, is the grounding operator. And if we don't explicitly critique that move, it's just going to remain there uncriticized, and we're going to find ourselves kind of acting out all of the, we may call ourselves atheists or materialists or whatever, but surreptitiously we will still be acting out all of those modes, putting purpose first in a certain sense, but like control, mastery, assimilation, subjugation, all of that kind of stuff. And so we need to do metaphysics as a critical process of exposing those presuppositions, but then not just to destroy them. We actually need to put something active in their place. Otherwise, again, we just go back into the same position where we're repressing them rather than reformulating them.
Let me just hop in here real quick because, I actually went to a grad program that was predominantly analytic philosophy with many physicalist professors, writers, researchers who were very inclined to hand over the discipline of philosophy to science and become its handmaiden in a sense, in disparaging certain approaches to thought as spooky or weird and things like that, just this blanket dismissal that would allow them to keep certain presuppositions intact. I actually want to define more clearly what you see as classical physicalism, or maybe non-classical physicalism. What does that look like? And the claim that I'm most interested in is the idea that every thought paradigm framework operates with a kind of unconscious. So, for example, one criticism of Marxism might be that it engenders, in an atheistic way, some of the Promethean tendencies that rarefy human productive capacity to a godlike level, whether you believe in that criticism or not. But I do think that is one of the fundamental moves that we need to make as philosophers is find ways to undercut those tendencies, or at least expose, to pull back the veil ever so slightly to see what's going on under the hood, as it were. But just back to the physicalism question, what is physicalism, and how do you see it recapitulating those theological tendencies that you referred to earlier?
Yeah. So what is physicalism? That could obviously be a big, long question. And, any short answer to that is going to provoke a lot of disagreement, of course. But what I think is really central here is the notion of effective theorization, the use of an effective theory. And the way an effective theory works is by defining the invariants, those things that are stable throughout the space-temporal scale, which defines the domain of the theory's applicability, so things that are stable at some scale, and in terms of which all variation can be understood. So you can think of those invariants as into the independent variables and any variation, the dependent variable. But basically what this ends up looking like in a lot of physical theory is the predefining of a phase or state space. So there's a space, and it's essentially a space of possibility. That's a way you can think of it. And all variation is now some kind of trajectory, a vector through that space, right? So all of possibility is predefined, circumscribed right at the beginning, and all variation, which if we go very classical, like in a Laplacian notion, is apparent variation because the thing is actually deterministic, but all variation is some kind of traversal or exploration of a state space that is predefined. And that's the key thing. So instead of having an ontogenetic approach where the space itself, which can be thought of as defined by, formal constraints, that space defined by formal constraints, instead of that having its own genesis. So I'm not saying that these kinds of spaces are not real, right? Like there's a reason that effective theorization is so effective in certain domains. So this is not a throwing away of that, but it is a relativizing of it. In an ontogenetic perspective, we are trying to think about the conditions of realization or construction of those state spaces themselves, rather than just saying, okay, these are spaces that are predefined by axioms, and then we are exploring the consequences of those axioms, and all dynamics of, say, physical systems are again movements through that predefined state space. We want to say that actually, like every time something moves, it redefined. There's a counter-effectuation, to put it in a sort of slightly Deleuzian register here. There's a way that the action of, let's say, material bodies, shorthand, is feeding back onto the space of possibility and actually deforming that landscape. This is really a very Simondonian point, and this is what he loves about fields. But yeah, that would be the kind of classical rationalist approach. And so that leads to the notion of things like a grand unified theory or whatever. It's the space in which all other spaces can be nested in some sense, right? The maximal space of possibility, and then all of the other effective theories, and physics is kind of like a stack of effective theories, right? All of the other ones which define certain regions, those can be nested within this grand unified, single, and you can think of it as a grand unified field at this point, but a grand unified space. So that's the essential thing. And so that is a very classical view. And you can think of it in terms of like the Laplacian view that the entire space of possibility can be defined and indeed determined in terms of boundary conditions and entailing laws. We can talk about Laplace's demon and that sort of thing as the kind of apotheosis of this view, if you like. But also in non-classical physics, what's really fascinating, physics starts going through the statistical turn in the 19th century. And that is, on the face of it, an erosion of the classical paradigm. It's an exposure of the insufficiencies of classical rationalism. But because the formal approaches are so powerful, there's always a way that you can nest that back in some more all-encompassing paradigm again, right? And this is, again, where we get this notion of grand unified theory. How are we going to unify all these theories? We're going to stick them in one big theory. And even where we get into, the statistical turn, that leads to quantum mechanics and all of that, there's still this desire, which I think characterizes the impetus of physical rationalism. There's still this desire to treat that in the classical mold. So in some sense, of course, we're radically beyond classical physics, if you define classical physics as like, Newtonian mechanics. But in another sense, the way theory development has gone is still based on that aspiration of nesting all of these things back in predefined state spaces. So that's essentially what I would call it. It's the continual assimilation of whatever novelty, wherever a theory has been broken, we just need a broader theory to encompass it. And we're still not getting away from a notion like unitarity in quantum mechanics. Everything has to have this kind of unitary relationship. So it then I think dovetails with a lot of the classical themes of philosophy that we're very familiar with and that people like Bataille are exploring, but also Simondon and others, like just unity, like primordial unity, and indeed this rationalist aspiration for having a complete system. So this is a metaphysical, and this goes back to the previous point, this is already a metaphysical approach. It's not empirical. And that's why it's physicalist rationalism, right? It's not just like physics as a science, which has its empirical component. It's the ideology that always seeks to submit that empirical component to the rationalist aspiration of making everything intelligible in terms of some sort of master theory or master space.
So looking at the paper that you gave me, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to give this out yet. If this is a work in progress, I will withhold it. Otherwise, we can link it in the show notes or...
That's definitely a work in progress, the little article that I sent you. There are talks that we can link. So I sent you a couple of PDFs as well, like the Life is Technical talk. So it is a project that kind of sprawls, but there are some things we can point people to, and then other things that, with a promissory note, we can say are in the pipe, coming.
One of the big themes in the paper, well, there's actually two, variation and excess. Let's start with variation. In evolutionary terms, you argue via Darwin that variation is primary and invariance in science is derivative. And this somehow inverts the logic of effective theory in physics. Now, hearing that with Deleuzian ears, it sounds a lot like, there's difference in identity, difference in repetition. Is there any way in which you're thinking this concept of variation that's a departure from Deleuze? Or how has this notion of variation as being primary sort of infused itself into the scientific milieu in the way that, for example, maybe Deleuze has shaken up the Hegelian conceit of the previous 125 years of philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really fascinating and very large question in and of itself, right? Because, I'm not attached to any particular word. There are different words that come up in different contexts, right? So variation, difference, variation would be the Darwinian term in some sense. Difference itself could be the Deleuzian term. Deleuze is cribbing a great deal from Simondon, and we can talk about the pre-individual, right? And we can talk in other contexts, as Simondon will do in things like his description of the image cycle. We can talk about autokinesis, so kind of spontaneity. We can, if we go into a Platonic register, which I think is a very important thing to do, to resurrect the kind of, repressed cora. So there's a whole discussion of active material here, of matter as active, which is, I think, very, again, dear to Bataille's heart. So we can think there about the cora. And the cora is the wandering cause. So you can think Kleinemann, like there's a whole series of things which operationally relate to each other. For Charles Sanders Peirce, we'd be talking about firstness. Or in his conception of different forms of evolution, we'd be talking about the contribution of chance, so teichic evolution, right? So he has teichism, anankism, which is evolution. So teichism, evolution by chance, anankism, evolution by law, agapism, evolution by lure or eros or love, right? Evolution towards a goal. So I'm not super attached to any particular term, and they're all loaded. And people will often say, well, you can't talk about variation unless you're talking about invariance, so those two things are always already polarized. And therefore, you can't say variation comes first. That doesn't make any sense. It's variation in relation to what? But that is this subtle move of assimilating variation back to the invariant, which is, again, the kind of mainstay of Western philosophy and rationalism, I think, with these obvious minority reports peppered throughout. What Darwin is saying basically is, Darwin is just looking at all of he's very empirical in his orientation, and he's just looking at all of these organisms, whether it's orchids or beetles or finches, birds, whatever it is. And he's like, the more I study these organisms and the more diversity I bring in, instead of just looking at one or two specimens, even of a given species, I'm looking at as many specimens as I can get my hands on, and they're all bloody different. And he says something like, it's almost as if every character had become plastic, right? So every trait that you could identify has at least some degree of variation. And he also starts to recognize that the way taxonomists, systematists are chunking up species is somewhat arbitrary. Now, he's not saying that there aren't real clumpings of variation. He's not saying that like species is a completely bankrupt concept. And we're not saying here that I'm not saying form is a bankrupt concept or invariance is a bankrupt concept. But he is saying that variations come first in the sense that they blur between these chunkings. There's always a kind of, people like to criticize evolutionary theory or Darwinian theory by saying that, oh, but there aren't any, intermediates or whatever. And it's like, well, the truth is, there are no end of them. You don't even need a fossil record. Like in extant species, there's just constant variation. And so he says, well, what if variation came first? What if there's all this variation going on? And then we needed a secondary principle, which is selection, in order to account for the non-random distribution of variation, right? So variation comes first. Why isn't everything just all smears? Well, it's not. So we need a principle of selection. That's where the principle of natural selection comes from. Now, it is very like, and I do think of, I would have definitely said this last time we talked, I do think of Deleuze as a Darwinian thinker in this sense. And I think, we can go to passages in A Thousand Plateaus and other places and see that very explicitly played out. Whether Darwin is being identified as the kind of mighty ancestor or not, there are lots of things in Darwin that people like to stand against as well, and that's fine. He himself wasn't a systematic thinker, so he didn't really explore the consequences of what is, I think, his primary insight to the nth degree. But the thing about the Deleuze thing, this is complicated as well, obviously, but where I think there's a potential issue sometimes in Deleuze is with the notion of the singularity. And there are two senses in which you might take this term singularity. And this is important for reading Simondon. And again, I think Deleuze is getting this at least partly from Simondon, but he's also writing about it before his engagement with Simondon, like in early essays on Bergson and things like that. And I think you can see some of the tension there. So singularity can either be a kind of thing that is different in itself, but is in some sense defined, right? Like is an actual singular, like it can't be assimilated to anything, but it is in fact defined. Or a singularity can be a limit at which our capacity to intelligibly understand something breaks down, right? So it's a very related concept because the singularity as the irreducible particular cannot be assimilated to anything. So it is a singularity in this sense of kind of theory breaking down, in the sense that there are like, singularities in general relativity, or there's ultraviolet collapse. And, like it's what I think of it as is the edge of the domain of applicability of a given effective theory. Like you reach the thing, but the problem is, if we then try to say that thing is always already predefined, like it's a particular, then we're back in this situation of, well, what's the genesis of that definition? Like, where does that, like, are we talking about a differential field where, in fact, it's kind of atomic at some level, and there are these or irreducible, undeconstructable singularities which are bare particulars? That's not the conception that I want to go with. And I think sometimes Deleuze goes with that. I want a genesis of that kind of picture, I don't want a picture that could ultimately be computational, right, where everything is completely gridded from the get-go. I want to say, no, there are preconditions. So there is, in a certain sense, a primordial continuity that the discontinuity has to emerge from. And I think that's it's obviously a very difficult thought in the sense that we are thinking at the limits of thought, but this is what I think Simondon is trying to give us. And sometimes I think that might be a little lost, at least in certain passages from Deleuze. Like, for example, before he reads Simondon, he writes on Bergson's conception of difference. And there we are talking about tendencies which are immortal in a sense, right? They're predefined, they're eternal. And I think that's the issue that, again, I think that's just subtly going back into the same old scheme of predefinition.
Well, that brings us to, I'm actually going to flash forward and go to a potential objection to treating ontogenesis as a first philosophy on the grounds that, in some sense, it has to account for the in media res reality of all burgeoning individuations or all existing individuations. Everything's always already underway. So how does the ontogenetic framework respond to the charge that it can never begin at the beginning because no beginning is ever given? Do you see the word itself, the term itself, ontogenesis, as engendering that presupposition? And is there a way around it?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question. So, I mean, one question is whether we should avoid, as a matter of sort of mental hygiene or trying to think beginnings as such, right?
Right.
And there is this argument that we should. And the other is if we should avoid that, how do we avoid it given this ontogenetic stance? And so, I mean, the ontogenetic stance can be applied to the disappearance of origins at all different timescales. So this is this notion of the singularity that I would want to uphold. It's given a degree of sort of dynamic evolution of any given system, if you kind of look back far enough or look forward far enough, you encounter a limit of your ability to, retrodict or predict based on extant data, let's say, based on whatever's available to you in the moment. So this could be like looking back for, 13.7, 13.8 billion years to the beginning of the universe in cosmology and encountering a kind of, inchoate wall and going like, hey, we just can't reconstruct anything beyond this. So we can treat that as an absolute origin, or we can just treat that as the end of our capacity to reconstruct something. In evolutionary biology, this is happening all the time. We're inferring ancestral states from extant data, but we are recognizing that the further away we go from the actual particulars that we are dealing with, the more inference there is, right? So the more, the error bars get larger and larger. And at a certain point, it's just not meaningful anymore to say like, so we are inferring some ancestral state, but at a certain point, we're always encountering like, what is the origin of this species, right? Or what is the origin of this character trait or whatever? It always disappears into some sort of vague, continuity, right? Again, that's the encounter of a singularity. Or, moment to moment, it could be the origin of your thought, or the origin of something in immediate experience, right? And those things, those origins disappear very, very close to the present moment, right? You can't reconstruct these things because, one way of thinking about that is that the dynamism of the system is such that the amount of contingent change that is getting in there at every moment, and again, this is if you're taking a certain kind of spontaneity or like, irreducible unreasonableness, like something that you cannot reason about. If you're taking that as a kind of first principle, you're always going to be left with this indivisible remainder, as someone like Schelling would say, right? However, I think it is important. So basically, the in media res situation is that we're just encountering this limit all the time, right? But there is nonetheless an importance, and I want to bring this back into our focus, of thinking origins as such. Right. So like the great cosmologist type, metaphysicians, let's say, or philosophers, and that includes people like Charles Sanders Peirce and Alfred North Whitehead, made a very concerted attempt to think origins, right, as such, right? So like for Peirce, thinking about the generative nothing, which for him is at the kind of beginning of like it's pre-time in some sense, right? For Whitehead, he has a convoluted system with creativity first and then the primordial nature of God and blah, blah, blah. And I definitely don't affirm that. I have a lot of critiques of Whitehead, but studying that is nonetheless important here, I think. And then what is often not remarked on in Simondon, in my opinion, is that he does bite this bullet himself in the conclusion to the big individuation thesis. So he does talk about pre-phasic being, the pre-individual as such, as a kind of prime mover in his philosophy. There's a key distinction. It's not a matter of identifying determinate origins, because we're trying to get beyond determinacy here, right? And this would be my critique of that Deleuzian notion in terms of there is a determinate singularity at the base of things there, at least in some expressions. But thinking the limit and imagining it as an absolute limit where you cannot rely on any pre-existing, pre-individuated structure, which will canalize the operation of ontogenesis, if you refuse to think that limit, if you refuse to think of the genesis of structure in general, then you are at risk of just going back into the same old problematic where you are in terms of putting the individual before individuation. So even though in all of his empirical examples and everything, of course, Simondon is talking about domains of reality in which there is already structure and operation are always co-defined, but he does, as a matter of speculative philosophy, try to think the absolute limit, which is prephasic being, which I talk about in that Jung Simondon, PDF that I sent you, and likened to some of Jung's descriptions of the pleroma. But so I think as an exercise for thought, it remains important to try and think that if you really want to get beyond the pre-existence and the kind of eternal existence in a certain implicit sense of something predefined.
Well, I think this brings us to one of our favorites here on the podcast, which is the work of Bataille and the notion of excess as it's operative within your work. And maybe just to give a quick and dirty, but it might be important to say that an encapsulated view of excess is that every presupposed enclosed social totality, for example, will always have some sort of social excess. Any sort of schema of production is always going to have waste involved, and what we do with that waste often folds back upon the socially productive apparatus. But at the same time, it raises the question of, is there a kind of negativity that is absolutely unemployable? Is there an excess which absolutely refuses the social order, as it were? This has implications too, perhaps for science. We take the form of this argument from Bataille, the accursed share, the absolute gift of the light of the sun spilling over the globe daily, almost to the point that there is so much that the earth does not know what to do with it. How do we envision this concept in terms of what you're working on now with Simondon and Darwin?
Yeah, so I do think, and I mean, there's a long series of analogies to be made here, right? Operational analogies, like what is the operation? And I mean, this already sounds like we're running afoul of some of Bataille's strictures, but, so what is the similarity, again, that sounds problematic, between excess and these notions of difference and variation and the pre-individual and all of that we are talking about? And I think the similarities are profound. And I think, it's fairly easy in a sense to see that in own critique of effective theorizations or his own critique of closure in the economic sphere or in thermodynamics, in fact, like he draws on a lot of thermodynamic metaphors to make that critique, the difference between, restricted and general economy and all of that. But, where I like to go to Bataille is in his descriptions of experience in particular, like I think this is some of his most profound writing on sovereignty. So what we're talking about is sovereignty here, the insubordinate activity, if you want, insubordinate event, which finds, and these are all loaded terms, purpose, meaning, etc., but only in itself, right? It is not for anything other than itself. So it is like play. It has no other goal other than just its own happening. And I think a lot of what Bataille is talking about is how, when we have and they can be, what I think of as prosaic experiences of laughter, for example, or spontaneous tears, whether positive or negative, a certain eruption of an emotion that pierces the cognitive frame that we are currently thinking under the auspices of or thinking through. So there is an encounter with a raw affect or with something in the world that is impossible. I mean, so death obviously is a big example for Bataille here. And in some sense, again, we can use death analogically because we're talking about the little death, I mean, obviously orgasm, but the dissolution of a certain effective theory of self, right? So the self is like an effective theory, right? It is a kind of model of relations between, the organism, us, and the world. And it is a predictive model. It's everything from like, I am the kind of thing that does X, and also the world is the kind of thing that, shows me X, and sometimes something happens in the world, or sometimes we find ourselves doing something that is not understandable or reasonable in terms of that prevailing psychic economy, right? So this stimulates the movement, which can be called, psychic catabasis. This is great links to Jung here, obviously, and Hillman, who I know you love. The dissolution, the de-differentiation, the disadaptation of the current prevailing model, essentially, in the face of the thing which it could not anticipate. And this stimulates in us this sovereign moment that Bataille calls the sacred, or the miraculous moment, in which we are no longer subject to any prevailing mode of organization, basically, right? So there's, of course, body without organs resonance here. There's a lot of resonance amongst all these different concepts. And again, there are ways we can think about body without organs in terms of pre-individual, and we can talk about empirical manifestations of that in actual contemporary biology. Again, we're making a series of non-reductive mappings, non-reductive analogies, not analogies of proportion, not analogies of resemblance, not assimilative analogies, but operational analogies, like what is the thing that is happening here, and seeing that in all these different spheres, which I think is justifiable to say that's what Bataille is doing. That's how he actually organizes his own thought. And then he tries to break it, of course, as well. But basically, this eruption of the unprethinkable, the unprestatable, and therefore the inassimilable, which stimulates that movement of, if you want, deterritorialization, dissolution. And then, of course, we know that inevitably, unless it's actual death, a new schema is likely to arise from this. And so that then also becomes a model of theory change. People may not like Karl Popper, for example, in this context, but this is conjectures and refutations in the sense that, there is a prevailing model of how things work. And it is in some sense, because Popper is a fallibilist, it's always conjectural. And then it is always subject to the possibility of refutation when something comes along which is just not assimilable to that notion. I'm avoiding saying paradigm because we don't want to get into differences between Popper and Kuhn, but there needs to be the reformulation of a new way of being. This is also, of course, very analogous. There's a reason that Popper is thought of as an evolutionary epistemologist to a Darwinian perspective on the organism. And again, when I say all of those things, there's always the possibility that people in certain circles will think I am doing this assimilative thing. But we have to remember that what is primary here is always the variation or the excess indeed. And we're saying all of this, assimilation, if you want, but the construction of these models, of these structures, is always predicated on the existence of their excess, right? On there being an outside. This is where, in a Guattarian sense, the organism maintains diverse relations to alterity. There is no individuation without relation, without the thing that cannot be assimilated, which is always irreducibly other.
Right. And I'm going to pick on a certain strand of orthodox Marxism here today. I enjoy Karl Marx's readings, very valuable. So I'm saying this with love when even that tendency in myself to pray at the altar of Karl Marx might be indicative of the imperiousness of particular theories like Marxism, insofar as this is supposed to explain the whole of human history and the conditions by which something like communism will emerge. And so when Bataille comes along and criticizes what was then a real existing communism at the time, seeing it take this detour into a kind of accelerated productivism under Stalinism, and seeing that in a way, the communism that existed at the time of Bataille was, to him, more deplorable in some ways than capitalism. Why? Because it mobilized a form of rationality at a level of efficiency and speed and precision that even the capitalists could not achieve. And so when trying to argue with this person that I argued with online recently and talking about the concept of an unemployable negativity, their rebuttal to that was, but don't you see, unemployable negativity, doesn't that presuppose employability and productivity and so on and so forth? And then that effective theory, it sort of armors itself again to impose itself against any objection or any kind of sprout of new thought that might pierce through the chink in the armor, as it were. Just going to the paper that you gave me, you had this term, apotropeic eliminativism. We need to unpack this because you're saying that rationalism in general, and we'll call the kind of communism that Bataille was criticizing, a form of deep rationalism. What is that term, apotropeic eliminativism? And how is rationalism trying to defend itself against the threat of the irrational?
Well, yeah, I mean, so many things to say here. I think one of the things that I haven't said yet, and just to respond very specifically on the unemployable negativity thing, is that whilst variation, or whatever term we're using here, is grist for the mill of selection, most variation is never selected, right? Most of this is waste. So most of it is not employed because it is not, again, pre-structured for employment. So some percentage of that will find a certain employment. I mean, we could talk about the paradox of meditative practice here. Am I meditating so that I can be happier and more, blah, 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 or even, heaven forbid, mindfulness more productive, etc. My meditation tends to be better to the extent that I don't try to grasp at its potential positive outcome. But in some sense, there is a positive outcome that I'm hoping for, so we're always, it's like improvising on a musical instrument, like letting it flow through you, having done all the practice and whatever to fine tune the instrument that is your body so that it can flow through you, not grasping, not even going, oh shit, that was pretty cool what I just played, at the moment of expression, not assimilating it to ego or assimilating it to some outcome, which is like sounding awesome or getting the right recording or whatever. Those are important prerequisites really for playing better. So you end up having this kind of paradox. But the important thing about play, real play, and free variation and all of that is that it cannot, even though some of it does lead to some kind of positive outcome, it cannot be for that in and of itself. Otherwise, it is already kind of neutered. And so we have to accept the fact that most stuff doesn't echo in eternity. This is actually a beef that I have with like Bergson and Whitehead. Not everything perishes into immortality, as Whitehead would say, right? A lot of stuff just goes by the wayside and doesn't have any effect on ongoing process or whatever, right? The past is selectively inherited, not inherited whole hog. Devil's in the details on the Bergson and stuff, I know. So that's important. Now, this apotropeic thing, I guess, we can go to Nietzsche here. So I just happen to have this quote in my Bataille notes from Nietzsche and from Twilight of the Idols, like with the unknown, one is confronted by danger, discomfort, and worry. The first principle is to abolish these painful sensations. First principle, any explanation is better than none. The search for causes is thus conditioned by and excited by the feeling of fear. The question why is not pursued for its own sake. So it's not that we can't ask why, but to find a certain kind of answer, an answer that is pacifying, tranquilizing, and soothing. Okay, so that I call apotropeic reason magic, right? Or having like an apotropeic talisman. That is something that you have to ward off evil, right? So in this case, it is to avoid having to engage with those painful sensations directly. So when we are suffering, like someone we love dies, this impossible event that, Bataille takes as kind of, dare I say archetypal, but like the quintessential impossible event, it just is not pre-thinkable because we have this thought that is structured by futurity for Bataille. We're thinking about all the things we're going to do with that person and we've got this life and everything. And then suddenly they're gone, and that's this impossible event. And we suffer, it hurts, right? And our tendency, according to this conception of apotropeic reason, is instead of sitting with that pain and just feeling it, we tend to start explaining it to ourselves. I feel this way because X, blah, blah, blah. And this tends to, this analytic approach tends to trend into an explaining away. It's a way of retreating into the intellect, away from affect, so that we in fact don't have to feel it. We are turning away from it. And so rationalism, which is all about, is in large part about mastery and control. Like, why do we want the whole world, everything to be intelligible? We want to be able to understand it so we can instrumentalize it. This is the inframing critique of science and technology that Heidegger has, although Simondon is just vastly better on that than Heidegger. But, we want everything to be intelligible. We want arche to be nous in this Platonic sense. Everything happens for a reason, the principle of sufficient reason. We just have to discover that reason, and then we will have some kind of mastery over it and mastery over ourselves, right? We won't even have to feel those pesky, horrible emotions because we'll already understand them. And understanding is a certain kind of, elimination, really, is what I'm saying when I say apotropeic eliminativism. So reason, in disavowing the constitutive nature of the unreasonable, the prior. This is why I do think thinking this origin or priority is kind of important in a sense. The prior condition of unreasonableness from which reason can arise. And I mean, again, people like Peirce and Whitehead, who were great logicians, like really great logicians, they did understand this. There is a limit to reason. And in fact, this is how science and, computer science goes or the theory of computation goes in the 20th century with Turing and the halting problem and oracle machines and, Gödel and incompleteness. Like there are lots and lots of ways of showing that even from the perspective of formalism cannot be self-grounding, right? And that's, so you can again, take stances in different places and see that this ineliminable existence, again, problematic term in scholastic terms, subsistence or insistence of the limit of that which cannot be assimilated, and thus that which is in a sense prior to the system, and the system itself is contingent upon. This is why historicization is also important, is contingent upon this ineliminable variation or excess as such. Formlessness, form is contingent on the formless, or not the formless, but formlessness. Denying that, which in the Nietzsche quote is a denial that we make to protect ourselves from feelings we don't want to feel. Also we deny it to protect ourselves from the limits from a realization that our control and mastery has limits. Like people can die and we will die and we cannot prevent it. And we don't want to face that. So we try to imagine that, this is what, like transhumanism, right? Is this rationalist wet dream, we're going to solve death. We're going to solve aging, all of that sort of thing. This is what I mean by apotropeic eliminativism. It doesn't just have to be about death. It just happens to be about death in this Bataille context, but it's about the unintelligible or the so-called void or whatever in general. We don't want that.
And I see a very profound connection between, I guess it boils down to tragedy and ecstasy in relation to this broader concept of rationalism. When we think about the escape of enjoyment, when we experience a tragic event, that is an enjoyment escaping us or being out of reach. And I'm thinking of the word enjoy as N-joy. We are not enjoyed in that moment. But the paradox is the kind of ecstatic enjoyment that we're talking about when we are involved in play or orgasm or what have you is an kind of enjoyment that escapes us to the point that we lose our claim on it as a self or as an individual. And in that sense, I don't think my thought on the tragic side is as well formed as what I'm saying now, but there is a connection there. And it's just profoundly interesting to me how all of that folds back upon the way that we do philosophy and metaphysics, and how that seeps into the substrate of the way that we think about the world and how it undergirds our most fundamental thinking about simple things, causality, purpose, and so on.
Yeah, well, I think the ecstasis connection is really important. So it's a condition of us having that type of whatever peak experience, enthusiasmos in a slightly more theistic context, I suppose, where you are emptying yourself kenotically so that, you can be possessed in some sense by the spirit. But it is a condition of that ecstasis that we're outside ourselves, right? That effective theory of self has broken down so that we are no longer limited by our preconception of what we are, of what a body can do, what we are and what we can do. And ecstasis literally, though, is like the unstable. It's a departing from, it's a moving outside, right? So it is always already something that denotes the excess. There is an outside and we're moving into it in some sense, or it's coming into us, maybe, we're letting the outside in, which is a way that I think a lot about things like open monitoring type meditation practices. But it's a process. This thing is dynamic. This thing is not eternal. It's ecstatic. It is not absolutely stable. It's not immortal. It can be moved beyond. It can be deviated from. And I think Bataille is very good on the way that there is, symmetry is not the term I'm looking for, but that relationship between the tragic, the negative, and like the thing that forces us to encounter. And again, we tend to have this kind of sort of apotropeic response to it. We try to turn away from it. But in some sense, at least for a moment, when we just can't help but cry or just break down or whatever, like have a nervous breakdown or whatever, in that moment before we recover ourselves and reassert our reasonableness and, blah, 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 we can see if we are worthy of what's happened to us, if we are paying attention in some sense, we can see that break, and if we're honest in the sense that Bataille is sort of, exhorting us to be, and this, of course, for him, kind of ends up in the I'm pursuing non-knowledge instead of knowledge sort of thing. Like I'm looking for those moments at which the thing breaks down. And there's a fascinating way in which he's obviously still pursuing knowledge, right? Like he's a fairly erudite dude, but it's knowledge that will expiate itself. It's knowledge against itself. So these moments of breakdown, whether they're positive or negative, they show us that that limit exists and that limit is kind of always with us. And then again, you can take this back into this context of, say, again, a meditative practice or whatever, what I would call like a meditation on difference, or, I think of, again, this as prosaic in the sense that it's always there. And Bataille says this, in fact, life is full of these moments if only we notice them. And again, it's almost a cliche to say, I'm a naturalist, not in the metaphysical sense necessarily, but in the like practical going out into the bush and looking at animals sense. This is how I grew up. Stop thinking, stop. I want to hear or see this bird. I want to hear or see this snake, whatever. Just allow whatever there is in this autonomous, or numinous in the Jungian sense, sphere of nature to arise and present itself. And you will see it or hear it or whatever only to the extent that you stop trying to pre-assimilate it to some kind of goal. So, yeah, all of these things to me are very, very closely related. And we can encounter that limit anytime we want to, in some sense, right? But sometimes it is forced upon us.
Well, let's test that claim against something that you actually wrote in the paper. You suggest that every individual, whether it's at the level of a quark or a human being, my Maltipoo, who's not in the room with me right now, you say prehends a distinct world, right? So we're talking about a kind of perspectivism from an ontological level. And prehension here is a kind of grasping, we would say, right? Or attending towards?
Yeah, yes, it's a Whiteheadian term, right? So you can think about it as experience or perception as well, right? Having a view on. So perception is a form of relation here, right? So to perceive something, you are in relation with it. And every individual, as you're saying, perceives a slightly distinct world, has a perspective in some sense, right?
Sure. Well, I guess what I'm getting onto is when we think about ourselves as individuals, there's a way in which we can imagine the individual as having a certain claim on a set of boundaries that we understand ourselves to be. We experience ourselves in terms of that prehension. Maybe that's in terms of the tendencies of perceptions that we have. But clearly, the process of individuation seems troubled by these ruptures, violences from the outside, letting the outside in that unsettles perhaps even the distinctness of the world that we are prehending. So how do we theorize the differentiation or the radical particularity that comes with being an individual, but then somehow coalesces into a metastable identity and maintains a continuity throughout a life, all the while at risk for these ruptures?
Yeah, no, it's a very important question. And there are a lot of ways of conceptualizing that. And we could go deep into science and like non-equilibrium thermodynamics for resources for thinking about this. And we can do what Simondon does. But I think, actually we will go with Simondon here. So we can say that the individual kind of is that set of boundaries. But the individual, if it's a vital individual in Simondon's sense, or even more so a psychic individual, is also both internally and externally always in contact with the pre-individual, right? So the vital individual doesn't exhaust individuation in, all in one go, but maintains within it the so-called charge of the pre-individual, right? So there is alterity. So there is an individual. Individuals are real and structurally crucial, important, right? It's not an explaining away of individuality where everything just blurs into this ongoing process, right? Like he is really trying to account for the appearance and not just appearance, the reality of stable structures. He wants to be able to do science. He's extremely engaged with science. And so what I would say this leads him to is, he doesn't call it this, but is what I would call a theory of natural abstraction. And that's also what I think, Whitehead's project is. But basically, the individual is always penetrated by or in relationship with the pre-individual, both inside and outside. There's a spontaneity, something that is not already assimilated by, canalized by, limited by, or constrained by the structure of the individual, which again, anatomically, spatiotemporally, is inside the individual organism as well as outside. And these two kinds of alterity, or these two kinds of spontaneity, that which is inside and that which is outside, they form a relationship which stimulates or elicits, I would say, another kind of movement of individuation, if you want. And so the individual then becomes what we'll say a phase in being. It's relativized, but it's a scale relative thing, right? So if you're looking at it is an effective theorization. So the individual is defined by a certain set of that you stipulatively identify, and that could be a self-stipulation as characteristic of yourself or characteristic of the object. And those are the things that remain relatively stable. So that at a given time scale or spatiotemporal scale, in fact, those things don't change while the other things change around them, right? And that can start to sound a bit, in a sense, well, there's the form and then all this accidental variation. But the key difference here, and we definitely talked about this last time, is that individual, that structure, is actually itself a relative stabilization, which is to the flux. And so given a certain degree of change, it is itself going to eventually become potentially unrecognizable. Now, in the course of a human life, we could be more or less plastic, and different subsystems of the human organism are more or less plastic. So, you could go through a conversion event and probably for people like you and me, we've been through many, and we make of our life an ongoing conversion event in some sense, right? But, you could be, I don't know, a hardcore atheist and have a psychedelic experience and, go through a hardcore conversion to some kind of monotheism or something like that. And to many people, you would be psychically, in terms of your personality or whatever, they'd be like, you're not the same person, man, like you are something else, but you still look like the same person, because in fact, other aspects of your, organismal individuality have not changed with the same degree of dynamism. I mean, maybe you shaved your beard or something, don't have the same degree of plasticity or dynamism as whatever's going on in the psyche. But then if you just think about lineages, so again, the individual human or whatever organism is a cellular lineage in some sense, if it's a multicellular organism, right? Development is the evolution of the individual, I always say. But if you stretch that out to more classic evolutionary lineage, given some period of time passing, it's not guaranteed, but it's highly likely that that lineage will become unrecognizable to itself, or at least it will have offshoots that become unrecognizable, and where some forms will be more, we say, plesiomorphic, close to the ancestral type, so stable over much longer periods of time. Other forms, which are descended from a similar ancestor, are much more different from the ancestor. So again, a lot of this is about thinking flexibly about very different temporal scales. And so one of the things I do ask also in that paper is, what exactly in a universe some 4 billion years old is the material, and we can talk about matter, but difference between the immortal and the merely inconceivably ancient? So we have all of these classical notions about identity and stability and essence, invariance, and all of that. But we used to think the Earth and the universe was a hell of a lot younger than we now realize that it is. Like on a human scale where we live for, if we're lucky, 100 years or whatever, we can't conceive of 1,000,000 years. We sure as heck can't conceive of 1,000,000,000 years. But we know from biology, geology, cosmology, that there are things that are stable for billions of years that nonetheless have a genesis, that nonetheless are not immortal or eternal. There was a period before the origin of life on Earth, but life has been here for 3.5 billion years. So I'm saying that this conception of deep time then, and this is what starts to reform physics, but it's an unfinished revolution in a sense, because physics still clings to this notion of eternality, atemporality, etc. The arising of the genuinely historical sciences in the late 18th century, so that's geology and embryology, and a critical form of history itself, and what the effects that this obviously has on philosophy via Kant and German idealism, blah blah blah. But then Darwin in the 19th century, etc., etc. We're still learning those lessons, and we've learned so much about the reality of time and irreversibility and history, and that should feed back onto our classical notions of essence and stability and identity and all of that in fairly profound ways. But for all the reasons we've been discussing, we don't necessarily want to allow those notions to be transformed.
Mm. I think I want to wrap up on a question that's a little bit off the script, but definitely grabs onto some of the terms that we're working with here: variance, an ontogenetic framework. And because you've had extensive contact with the work of Carl Jung and James Hillman and stuff, it's time to talk about psychology and dreams. And I'm actually also going to rope in Pierre Klosowski here. I often think about dreams. And today we also talked about how, for example, we can feel suffering in a seemingly raw and primordial way, but then there's this other thing that we do where we analyze it, we narrativize it, we interpret it, and we put it into frameworks. So there's this tension between what we could call the sort of gregarious world of analysis, where there's shared discursive realities, and then there is that seemingly solipsistic, but really at bottom is just a kind of mute intensity that is our radical singularity as the individuals that we are here on planet Earth. And all that preamble just to say, like when we have dreams, that is an intensely private experience. But then, of course, we go to analysis, or we put our dreams online, we tell people at work about them. And then now we are in the world of discourse. And it seems to me, the way that I look at it, like when we look at Klosowski's model of mute intensity versus the gregarious realm, there's a kind of epistemic substitution that goes on. Like there's two kinds of epistemologies, right? One radically singular, one that's collective and shared, if you will. And I was wondering, well, first of all, if you agree with that reading, but is there a way of explaining that through an ontogenetic framework or an excess-oriented framework using the figures that we're dealing with today, Simondon, Bataille, maybe even Darwin in some way? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really, really cool turn in the conversation. I mean, is there a way of explaining it? So we'll have to be
reinterpreting it, and once again, it's fraught with the same problem that we have, is that I've presented to you a series of terms that I'm familiar with for understanding these often very inchoate experiences, and asking you to use your well-developed ideas that you gave to me in this 5-page paper to see if there is a commensurability of our ideas.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and totally legitimate.
Me too.
Yeah, no, so I think there absolutely is. And so one of the things that I did gloss over very quickly in that little excerpt that I sent you is the difference between prosaic, inquired, and speculative stances towards reality, or even domains of reality in a certain sense. Our private experiences are, well, I call them prosaic in a certain sense. They are, in a Peircean sense, they're a kind of firstness. In the Jungian register, we need to bring in the notion of psychic reality as a very important, really what is characteristic of Jungian psychology, what Gigerik would call the psychological difference There's a whole conversation to be had about why I think once you that difference and start trying to ontologize Jung and all of that, you are outside the Jungian sphere already. Which is, again, we've talked about the necessity of metaphysics and the difficulty of not transgressing certain boundaries, but there are also reasons to erect boundaries between what you described as different modes of epistemology or different kinds of discourse or discourse versus experience as such. And so I have this notion that I've had for a really long time, when I was like a young psychonaut and I was also a budding scientist, and I was trying to, I was reading a lot of sort of psychedelic literature and enjoying it and recognizing some of the experiences that were discussed, but also being a little bit wary of a certain loose tendency that you might find in some of that literature to kind of leap from experience to ontology. And, this led me to develop this notion that I call the legitimacy of experience, or prosaic legitimacy, the legitimacy of firstness, which means that, experiences are real, right? This is psychic reality, right? They are irreducibly, like you had that experience and nothing anybody can say is going to or should have an effect in reducing the reality of the experience as such. So I call this the legitimacy, and that legitimacy is inviolable, but it never extends to anything you say about them. Right? It never extends to any candidate explanation, because as soon as you start talking about your experience and going, hey, what I saw was this or whatever, you're now in the world of inquiry, right? So you've moved from what I call the prosaic, and now you're in the world of inquiry. And that's where science and maths and logic and all of this stuff live. Now, my critique that we're talking about here is that the world of inquiry cannot deny the reality of the prosaic world of lived experience, right? Or the fact that it is, in some sense, I don't want to use the term grounded, but in some sense, it's dependent upon the world of lived experience. And the world of lived experience is also always excessive in relation to science and logic and those sorts of things, and this is a sense in which empiricism is always like excessive with regard to rationalization. But as soon as you start talking and giving an account of your experience, now you're in the world of inquiry, and we can bring all the tools of inquiry to bear on the claims that you make about your experience. But you should be able to hold that experience itself aloof from that. It has its irreducible excess. And so I think we could use Jung, because this is the positive psychic reality. So this is the sense in which Jung considers himself, like following James to some degree, a radical empiricist. Like he takes the accounts of his patients absolutely seriously. This is why Hillman talks about letting the images stand on their own in a certain sense. That's very consistent with Jung's positive psychic reality, in my opinion. We could talk about Hillman as a Jungian and all that, something I've been wanting to talk to you about. But just to finish this line of thinking, I've got a few quotes here from Inner Experience. This experience, says Bataille, born of non-knowledge, remains there decidedly. Experience reveals nothing and cannot be the basis of belief or set out from it. Experience is questioning. And then this is the key bit, right? The experiencer cannot say, I have seen this. What I have seen is this. He cannot say, I have seen God, the absolute in the depths of the world. He can only say, what I have seen escapes understanding. And God, the absolute, the depths of the world are nothing if they are not categories of understanding. So what I love about Bataille as a writer on experience, it's the way that he rejects what he thinks of as mysticism and why he prefers the term inner experience, because he sees the assimilation of apophasis, if you want, to cataphatic theology in all the great mystics, in Dionysius, in Eckhart, in all these people. He sees the assimilation of that experience of, something that I didn't understand, but I had an experience of it, to an understanding, to a positive theology, as a betrayal of that experience. And this is where Jung, at his best, and Bataille are absolutely simpatico. Like if you read Jung is more negative. His theology is more, even though he has this full-on monotheistic aspect to his thought as well, his negative theology is more negative than the theologians. And he is always calling them out for their idolatry and the way that they actually move from a treating of the image or whatever as numinous, as having its own autonomous, inassimilable in subjugatable, like non-subjugatable, whatever, reality to this is a manifestation of God or whatever, to some category of the understanding. Jung is always decrying that. And this is exactly what Bataille is saying here as well, in my opinion. And so, yeah, that's how I would respond to your question.
Yeah. And I think that's what Hillman is emphasizing. I mean, maybe ultimately there is no big difference between Hillman and Jung in the last instance on this, which is, and I really like the distinctions that you have. So just to highlight those again, prosaic, inquiring, and speculative, right? So I think one of the things that even somebody like Hillman urges us to do, and Bataille is absolutely doing, is we have these experiences that occur at the level of the prosaic, which, despite the term that you're using, does not make them inferior in any way. It engenders this aesthetic quality. It's the experience of aesthesis. Our tendency is to want to take those experiences and move them to the level of inquiring or, create grander speculations about it. But the real God level move at the end of the day is to have these concatenations of prosaic experiences that maybe don't have a reference to themselves. Maybe the word reference is in the domain of inquiring and speculation, but a continuity and a concatenation that has a resonance, which is much like the play of a child that transitions from like, okay, now we're playing house, now we're playing cops and robbers. And there is no hard break in the play. There's a kind of continuity that takes place. Oh, check this out over here. I didn't see that. Hey, there's a big fish in the creek right now. Come run down and take a look, and then next thing you know, everyone's in the creek and they're swimming around. The fish is gone. New game has arisen, right? So that's a visualization of not necessarily an avoidance of that tendency, but maybe it is a preempting of that tendency to move from the prosaic to the inquiring to the speculative.
Yeah. And I think, insight does emerge in the transition between the two,
Sure.
But there is, because again, in Jungian terms, and there's a sort of egregious primitivism that he indulges in here, but well, I guess he gets the term from Lévi-Bruhl, right? There's a participation mystique, right? That is the just being in the prosaic itself. And in some sense, that generates no insight. But moving between the two without subjugating the one to the other, especially without subjugating the prosaic to the inquired, and also the speculative has a very key relationship here. The speculative is where that minimal diagram, which is the minimal conditions of realization, lives. And I'm like, that's all that lives in the speculative in some sense. But there are all these bridges that I would talk about between these different domains. So there are kinds of discourse, like a mythopoetic discourse that you find in, of course, a lot of religious texts, that is an attempt to build a bridge between the prosaic and the speculative. But collapsing that discourse into one or the other, like making the mythopoetic the speculative, that's a big problem for me. Treating the prosaic as like reifying the prosaic into a discourse and saying, well, I have the authority of experience. I had that experience. That's also a kind of, it's actually ironically a betrayal of the experience itself, because what's great, again, in a Bataillean register, what's so important about the experience is that it is not on the plane of authority or mastery. By trying to make it authoritative, you are now, in a sense, subjugating it to an idealistic image of authority, and that's going to warp the experience itself. So, but to your point, prosaic is definitely not inferior. It's obviously a polemical, like a rhetorical move to call it the prosaic, but it is basically saying, like, we're always already in that if we're paying attention, It's here now. This is like a Zen thing, just sitting as Zazen, it's like, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to drop the acid. You don't have to, cultivate the practice for all your, it can help to do those things. But those things remind you of the fact that you're always in that kind of excess of the prosaic. Yeah. Do you want to talk about the Hillman thing?
All right, let's wrap on Hillman. Go for it.
Well, only just to say that I think it is key that Hillman does refer to himself as a Jungian, but I think what he's doing, like Jung himself is this very expansive and inconsistent thinker, right? And it's intentional. Like he's not systematic. He doesn't want to reduce everything to system, even though he has little systems within the non-system. He has his typology and all of that, but he also has a method. And if you read his writings on psychotherapy, I think that's really key, where he talks about this kind of radical empiricism, this radical openness to what arises in the session, and then not pre-assimilating or pre-subjugating whatever the patient is throwing at you with the pre-established schema, the typology or whatever, right? And I think, what Hillman does and why it's such a vital intervention into sort of Jungianism or whatever, or the Jungian community, is that what Hillman does is compensation on the level of the Jungian community. Because what happens in Jungian studies far too often is that the sort of slightly more essentialistic, sort of quasi-systematizing, whatever aspect of Jung's thought becomes the whole of it. And people forget that actually he repeatedly exhorts us to put method before system, which I think is what Deleuzean kind of thing, right? He's like, yeah, we need systems, we need maps. I need maps, but you know what? You should make your own, guys. Like I made maps, but my map is not the map, but I needed it. But method before map. And I think Hillman, with all his emphasis on multiplicity, the numinosity of images, all of that, he is providing this kind of critique or compensation for the Jungian community, where in Jung's own thought, that compensation is already there. Jung's personality 1, personality 2, however you want to think about it, they're already internally problematizing and contradicting and compensating for one another. Yeah, and so I guess that's the way that I like to think about that. And I prefer the Jung that Hillman, like that's my Jung, So even when we get to things like archetypes, and this is a whole long conversation, but I will go to a reading like the discussion on the pleroma in the Red Book, and I'll say, well, here Jung is at his kind of pre-individual best, and if you take that kind of thing seriously, and you can look at all the different stuff that he says about archetypes in this context, archetypes must themselves individuate. I mean, the image itself, which is individuated in a certain sense, is not the archetype. An archetype is what Simondon would call, and speaking of Jungian archetypes, an affectivo-emotive theme. It's actually continuous in a certain sense. It is pre-individual, but even that particular current in the pre-individual in some sense needs to have its own genesis. And I think you can find in Jung, if you want to uphold that reading, obviously if you want to uphold some kind of essentialist, eternal forms kind of reading, you're going to find that in there too. But I don't want to do that. So,
yeah. Well, I think that's also why Hillman privileges things like differencing, particularization, and so forth. And the method is, when presented with a particular image, eliciting sensations, maybe even free associations. But I often see Hillman, at least in the glimpses that you get of the work that he's done, is very much in tune with the sort of sensate dimension of an image. And could I risk saying the word intensity was important to him? Yeah.
I think that's, again, very related to this Simondon conception of the archetype as an affectivo, emotive theme, right? And Simondon thinks those are the things that communities come together, and you have the trans-individual dimension then because of a shared resonance of affectivo emotive themes. So there is, in a certain sense, an archetypal coordination, and that becomes objectified in symbols. But these affectivo emotive themes, you and I share some kind of affect and theme that is at least quasi-inchoate, is not fully assimilated to some symbolic manifold or whatever. I mean, Simondon has a full account of the genesis of psychic objects and psychic reality as such in his image cycle in the book Imagination and Invention, which I think is just, like, Jungians need that, in my opinion. And so Hillman is very complimentary there, but Simondon kind of gives us a technical apparatus with his transdisciplinary, and I like trans there in terms of transgressive, like transgressing the boundaries of discipline. He has this transdisciplinary account of objectification, which is really individuation, the genesis of individuals, which again I call natural abstraction as well. And when he applies that to the psychic, that I think is a very, very important tool for Jungians, because it can give them what they want, but also temper that excess of prefamationism, which you sometimes find in those contexts.
It was great to see you again on the podcast today, and maybe we'll let listeners have another little glimpse behind the veil, because in 2026, you may be doing a class with us at the Acid Horizon Research Commons, and it may, in fact, involve many of the things that we saw here today. So let's imagine for a moment you're teaching a 4-week class centered on ontogenesis, excess, Bataille, Simondon, Darwin. What can we expect over 4 weeks?
Well, I don't have a syllabus.
Coming soon.
I think what will be key is the, somewhat rigorous, but not going to be full of equations, but integration of this with the history of modern science and contemporary scientific practice, right? And to show what does science, like where does science move into this rationalist mode, and how does it sort of subjugate the excess and the variation and whatever, but also, when we look at the arising of the historical sciences, Darwin's positive variation first, there'd be a historical aspect of the course in like, what is the impact of that on physics? We think about the impact of physics on biology all the time. Of course, it's profound, but what's the impact of biology on physics, but also on modern philosophy? Like Kant, if you've read Jennifer Mensch's book, Kant's Organicism, Kant is reading embryological texts when he's writing the first critique, right? It's not just the third critique where he's considering this stuff. It's more in the bedrock, or in the undercurrents of the first critique. So what's the effect on modern philosophy? What's the effect also on physics? And what is the effective theorization paradigm? And how can we think beyond it in a way that enables us to build bridges between the kind of philosophy that we really like and even some of the more fringy stuff that I know left-hand viewers, listeners really love, like magic and all that kind of stuff? Like, how can we create an image of science which is a very powerful set of methods in the space of inquiry, but is not always perceived as sucking the juice or the joy or the wonder out of life or whatever, like back to a science of wonder in some sense, but a fully technical one. This is why Simondon is so useful, right? The account of techne is actually really important here. Like, what is techne? So, I don't know exactly what we'll talk about, but we'll talk about how to think about these concepts that we've been on about today, some of these thinkers that we've been on about today, in a kind of reparative relationship with science, and what that should mean potentially for the history of science itself, and where I think there are kind of certain wrong turns being made even right now by some of my colleagues, where it's another turn, like a turn towards the Platonic, but in the wrong sense, a turn towards the nousas arche sense of Platonism instead of the resurrection of the chora, active material, choric materialism. So something like that. History of philosophy, history of science, but some actual rigorous engagement with some scientific paradigms to show that these things don't have to be in conflict. We can have that cake and eat it too, in some sense.
Well, Tim, thank you for giving us another great interview, and I want to suggest to listeners that, well, if you made it this far, you probably enjoyed this installment of Left Hand, and you would probably enjoy many more, and the fun things that we have to come in 2026, including some exciting changes that will expand this podcast. Please subscribe to Left Hand at the $5 level, and you will get episodes like these via early access. For now, that is the primary benefit of being a subscriber to Left Hand. However, in the future, in 2026, we plan to do a whole lot more. So go ahead, navigate to the links below, find the links to Timothy's work, and we'll see you next time.